I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria. I came from a close-knitted family, even though I came from a poor family. But they gave me education with the instruction that this is the tool that will help me to dig my way out of poverty and ignorance. I came without a dime in my pocket. All I had was big dreams, determination to succeed, and the resilience. So coming from another country gave me that insight to be able to understand and deal with people from different backgrounds.
I was walking into Kroger to pick up a prescription for my mom. Upon approaching the pharmacy, I slipped and fell in some liquid. I went to see my regular doctor, and that is when I knew that there was more going on from that fall. I then called Mr. Olawale, talked to him and let him know what was going on. I could just say that he's very professional and knowledgeable about what he does. He's very passionate about what he does, and he cares about his clients. I felt like I was a part of the Olawale family.
The goal is to make sure that our clients will leave feeling that someone gets them, knowing that someone was able to be the voice for them.
We needed an attorney because we needed somebody who understood the relationship between our case and the law. We had been through 4 different lawyers. We were very desperate. We knew from what we had heard that Emmanuel Olawale was the man, who could take us through that experience and see us through and give us the kind of outcome we were looking for. For him, your case is personal. He gave us hope. He gave us encouragement, and we knew that we had found the right man that would see us through.
Just know that when you're coming through the door, you're coming in through a place where you will be accepted and welcome as family, where you'll be seen as a person. At the Olawale Law Firm, we get you. We understand you. Trust us. Welcome to this exciting episode of Legal Angle with Emmanuel the Law Olawale. I have my guest today is not a stranger to Legal Angle because he's been on Legal Angle before. His name is Zach Gwin, and the Gwin rhymes with win, so he's a natural winner. Welcome to the show, Zach.
Hey, thank you so much, Emmanuel. Very glad to be back. Thank you.
And I'm glad to have you. And for those who have not met you before, can you please tell us a bit about yourself?
Yes, so my name is Zach Gwin. I'm a candidate for Franklin County Municipal Court. I'll be on the ballot in November. I'm an assistant city attorney with the Columbus City Attorney's Office. Sorry, a senior assistant city attorney with the Columbus City Attorney's Office in Zach Klein's office. I work in the zone team, and that works to handle nuisance abatement issues within the city of Columbus. I'm originally from Canton, Ohio. Attended Miami University, where I met my wife, and then came to Columbus to attend the Ohio State University College of Law. I live in the Franklinton neighborhood with my wife, our son Ronan, who is 4, and what is now our 2.5-week-old son Rory, who we are enjoying our time with.
Thank you. And what has it been like with Rory? Because you just had Rory just 2.5 weeks ago. How are you transitioning to being a father of 2?
It's a little bit different trying to make sure you got coverage for everybody, but a little more familiar at least with the baby stage. So I think we're handling that a bit better than the first time, but making sure that we're attentive to Ronan, and then also on top of all the baby stuff. It's a process, but it's been great so far.
Yeah. And
And
you're
mom and
also,
baby are healthy. Yeah.
oh, great. It's good to hear that. You're also running or campaigning to become a judge. This is your second time around doing that, and I know it's very rigorous, especially you just came out of a campaign last year. So what has the experience been like?
It is exhausting. Anybody like yourself, running a campaign, it takes everything you've got, and you've got to have commitment. You've got to be committed. Your family is in it, whether, they like it or not. So they need to be committed. And so what happened was we ran for Franklin County Common Police Court last cycle and came within less than 300 votes out of 360,000 votes of winning. Came down to a recount, and unfortunately, we came up short. But an opportunity presented itself to run for the open seat in Franklin County Municipal Court. Judge Cindy Morehart, who is termed out, is not running again, obviously. And so we had the opportunity to run for that seat. Franklin County Municipal Court is where I started about over 10 years ago now. Started working for City Attorney Richard C. Pfeiffer, helping with arraignments, and then became a law clerk there. I was on the trial staff for 3.5 years. It really is where I've started and where I've spent the bulk of my time for the past decade is in Franklin County Municipal Court. And so we're excited about the opportunity to join the bench there.
Yeah, that's great. And in the last election, it was nail biting. What was it like for you during those waiting times when you don't know whether you've won or you've lost? What was the experience like?
It's a weird sort of limbo to be in, is that period, because obviously you have election night and we were short by a few thousand votes, but what's left out there are provisional ballots and late absentee ballots. So folks who might drop their ballot in the mail only a day or two before the election day or the day of election day. And so those ballots still needed to be counted. We knew there were quite a few out there. And so it takes a couple weeks for those to get counted, and then those numbers dropped, and we came within a couple hundred votes after those. And because of the closeness of the race, there was a mandatory recount. So you're waiting another few weeks while they recount those ballots. But in Ohio, and I think nationwide, with the way ballots are, the elections are conducted, recounts don't generally change more than a few dozen votes, just because of the way the system is administered. So after those provisional and late ballots came in, we figured it might be pretty much a done deal.
Mm. When you realize that you've lost to the incumbent, how did you feel?
Well, I think, like I said, it was a great experience. We knew we were going up against well-respected, long-standing incumbent, and it was, we look at it as it was a great experience to get out there to talk to the community about our vision, about my experience in the legal system, and it kind of inspired us that, with coming so close against such a long-standing incumbent, that we had a lot of ability in terms of running a race, and coming that close, we thought we could be successful going forward.
Yeah. What are those lessons that you took from that experience that you are applying to your new campaign?
Just being confident about getting out there and talking to folks is a big thing. It's like I said, as running for election, you're really putting yourself out there. So you got to get out of your comfort zone in terms of talking to folks you've never met before, or groups who you might not know. So I think just getting the so-called reps in of getting out of your comfort zone, talking to folks, and explaining kind of your vision is what we've been able to kind of carry forward.
And there's no campaign without the family. How was your better half handling this?
I am
And how did you handle
incredibly,
the
I'm incredibly blessed to have a wife and a partner who is invested in this process. And there's no campaign without your spouse's or your partner's buy-in. So I'm very fortunate that she was ready to run it right back. She understood that this was a great opportunity, even though at the time she was already 6 months pregnant, and she knew we'd be dealing with raising 2 kids and a very new baby at the time. But she's doing well, and we're just kind of taking it one day at a time.
Thank you. Now, you currently work with the city attorney's office. How did you end up there in the first place?
So, just while I was in law school, like I said, I started out as an intern, helping out with arraignments in what's called 4C arraignment court, now the municipal court. Then I was hired as a law clerk, working under now First Assistant Melanie Tobias, uh, doing traffic arraignments, but also having the opportunity, even as a law student, to try cases. There is a certificate you can get with the Ohio Supreme Court that allows even a law student with the supervision of an attorney to try cases. So I was, not even a lawyer, full blown lawyer yet, and I was already trying cases in Franklin County Municipal Court. I was then, after I passed the bar, hired on as trial staff and worked in basically every courtroom in front of every judge in Franklin County Municipal Court, trying cases. And so, in municipal court, for folks that aren't familiar, those are all of your misdemeanor criminal offenses. So, everything from uh, traffic offenses, speeding, car accidents, all the way to domestic violence, vehicular homicide, cases like that. And so, for 3.5 years, dealt with every manner of case in front of multiple judges, tried cases to judges and juries. And after that time, opportunity presented itself to go into private practice. And I joined a small firm called Farlow and Associates. And my primary practice was criminal defense in Franklin County Municipal Court and other municipal courts in Central Ohio. Also handled some felonies, and then had a small civil practice, general litigation, things like that. It was around this time that I became very involved in the neighborhood that we had moved to, which was it's Franklinton. It's a neighborhood on the west side of the city, historically one of the most disinvested neighborhoods in the city of Columbus. But began volunteering, became a member of the Franklinton Area Commission, and the city attorney's office originally started under Rick Pfeiffer. There was a group called the Zone Initiative. And so their job was to handle nuisance abatement, problem properties in the Franklin County Environmental Court. And while I was in private practice, I was approached by the Columbus City Attorney's Office and Zach Klein about joining the office for a specific role handling nuisance abatement on the west side of the city. So in my neighborhood in Franklinton, but also in a neighborhood called Hilltop, and then parts of Columbus that are west of the Scioto River. And so that opportunity was one that I was very excited about, to really work in the community that I lived in, that I volunteered in. And so joined that back in 2018. And so for the last 5 years, been working in the Franklin County Environmental Court, handling those nuisance abatement cases.
Thank you. And part of what you do is shutting down drug houses.
Yes, that is absolutely, one of the jobs that our office does. And so really but any sort of nuisance abatement. So we have multiple clients. So obviously Columbus Police would be the one, or, sometimes federal agencies or county law enforcement to help with nuisance abatement for drug houses, different task force that do narcotics investigations or human trafficking. But we also represent Columbus Building and Zoning Services, so everything from code enforcement to vacant and abandoned buildings, Columbus Fire, when you have properties that are fire hazards, things like that. But drug houses are definitely one of the more interesting type of cases that we handle to address properties that are really a hazard to the community.
And how do drug houses impact the community?
So, at a very base level, a lot of these drug houses end up being associated with felony offenses of violence, violent crimes, shootings, just any manner of disturbances that occur in the neighborhood. And living on the zone that I also work on, I know firsthand what it's like to deal with some of these nuisance properties. We've actually had 3 houses on my own street that turned out to be drug houses that we initiated actions on for nuisance abatement. So these are neighboring properties that you don't want to have your kids walk down the street past, because you don't know what might happen or what's going on at the property. So really, it's about the quality of life for residents and making sure that they can feel safe and secure, just going about their day and living their lives in their neighborhoods. So it's important that we address these problem properties so that folks have the opportunities to succeed and feel safe in their community.
Thank you. You just mentioned that it is important that we identify these properties. How do you identify a drug house?
So there are a multitude of ways. Columbus police frequently get referrals to the narcotics tip line, and that's just ordinary citizens who might identify a house and they see things, a lot of kind of telltale signs, such as a large amount of foot traffic, vehicles coming and going after very short visits, disturbances, but also sometimes, folks just find needles laying out in the yard or on their sidewalk. They're not always the most subtle type of places. Then Columbus Fire, we look at numbers in terms of overdose runs. Columbus Police patrol officers will refer properties to us if they've identified them as being a drug house or having a problem with violent crime. So there's those formal methods, but then also part of our role as zone attorneys is very much to be out in the community. So we're going to area commissions, or we're going to block watches or civic associations and just talking to neighbors and residents. And more frequently, you'll just be in a conversation with somebody and they'll let you know, hey, somebody told me about, or I've got this house across the street from me and things are totally out of control. Can you look into it? And sometimes what will happen is we'll find out that there is an investigation, or we are able to initiate an investigation that results in us filing a nuisance abatement action. And so procedurally, what that looks like is under Ohio Revised Code 3767 is kind of the basis for most of our actions. We file these cases to say that the owner or the occupants or persons with care and control of the property are maintaining a nuisance, and a public nuisance is defined as felony drug activity, prostitution. It can also be gambling and alcohol offenses, and even kind of an interesting one is the idea of a hideout for gangs or a refuge for people who commit felony offenses. And so we file these cases to say that, an owner is aware or should be aware that the offenses are happening at the property. They have not abated the nuisance, and the city can come in and ask for an injunction. So all of our cases are for injunctive relief, whether, for a preliminary injunction to potentially board up the property and remove the occupants, or just to enjoin and a court order that says you shall not maintain a nuisance, meaning you will prevent any future felony offenses of violence or other criminal activity from taking place at the property. And so we file that not just against the owner, but frequently the tenants and also the real property. So the actual land and the house, we file an injunction against. And if successful in court, what that means is that we have a permanent order against the property itself. And that is an order that can last in perpetuity to say that anybody who owns this property or lives at this property shall not maintain a nuisance. And it gives the city, an opportunity to potentially reopen the case if after a board up period or after whatever happens, it becomes a problem again.
What are those challenges you face when trying to shut down a drug house?
You always want to make sure that you cross your T's and dot your I's and you're bringing a strong case. You don't ever want to, be presenting a case that you're not confident in terms of the strength of the evidence, the investigation, making sure that you have all of your, what we would call predicate offenses that have been established, such as drug sales, overdoses, those felony offenses of violence that I talked about. So you want to make sure it's strong in that sense. And then there are times when we will bring in neighbors or other concerned parties who can just talk about the general reputation of a place. They can say, I live 2 houses down. I've seen the activity. I've heard the gunshots, things like that kind of, really drive home the point of the nuisance and the problems that this property is creating for the neighborhood.
And when trying to get neighbors to come testify in court, Have you had situations where maybe because of the fear of reprisals, they don't want to cooperate?
Yeah, well, I don't want to say not cooperate, but you always need to be careful about, the potential for retaliation and making sure that a resident or someone who is helping you identify these properties doesn't feel unsafe by testifying or bringing in evidence. So there are definitely times when we will just, use them to provide kind of base information and background on the property. But where they do feel comfortable, I think it helps a lot to have a neighbor really give you the human perspective of what it's like to have to deal with a drug house next door to you.
Thank you. Can you take us through the process of initiating the action and what the process in court and the length of time it takes to finally shut down the house?
Yeah, so there are two ways we typically file these. Sometimes we will file them as ex parte temporary restraining orders, which means we draft our complaint for injunctive relief. And, a motion 60 under Rule 65, we file with the court for a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction. And we approach the court. And in that circumstance, if it's ex parte, there's no opposing party that is present, and we will have detectives, patrol officers, uh, any sort of law enforcement or other witness who is able to testify about the nuisance activity. They will come testify, and we will present the court with a proposed order for a temporary restraining order to board up the house if the court finds there is sufficient evidence of the nuisance activity and that the owner is aware or should be aware of the nuisance activity taking place. And in that case, when those ex parte orders are issued, we generally ask for authority to go out that day immediately and go remove the occupants and board up the property. So that is a very quick result. Obviously, when you're making a motion for a temporary restraining order and it's ex parte, there are certain base levels of evidence that you need to present and show likelihood of success on the merits, and that there is a urgency and an exigency to getting that order granted. Now, the other way that we typically will file those, and honestly more common now, is under a just motioning for a preliminary injunction. And so that is about 10 days from the time that you file the complaint. Service is made on the owner and the other parties that are listed in your complaint, and then a hearing is set in front of the judge. In that case, the defendant will be present, has the opportunity to cross-examine witnesses, testify themselves, or there are also times when, after we file these cases, the owner is able to come to the table and can agree to a board up, an injunction, or certain conditions if people are going to remain in the property. And then, after that preliminary injunctive hearing, what happens is the case is set for a permanent injunction. And so after the case is filed and after that initial order, we then can go through the entire process of, civil discovery, depositions, things like that to, establish what we think is the strongest case for a permanent injunction that runs with the land, is binding on the real estate, and then also enjoins the owner from maintaining a nuisance at that subject property or any property within Franklin County. So really an order saying that any property they own, they cannot have this type of activity taking place. From the time of the first order, it can take a few months, it can take up to a year to reach that permanent injunction hearing. But the ultimate remedy, if we aren't able to come to an agreement, is that permanent injunction and up to a 1-year board up of the property from the time of the permanent injunction hearing.
Thank you. So what happened after the 1 year bought up? What happens to that property?
So ultimately, it can be used again. The city is always interested in making sure that properties don't remain vacant and abandoned or vacant and boarded up. So the idea that we hope there is a positive use for the property moving forward, but we always do have that backstop of the permanent injunction. So we can motion to hold an owner in contempt if, after they have access to the property again, the nuisance activity continues. But frequently what will happen, rather than going forward and having no agreement, we will work with owners to have a shortened board up period, with the understanding that the owner and essentially the property are kind of under a probation of sorts. So it's requiring them to do tenant screening, requiring them to maintain the property a certain way, to pull police reports periodically to make sure that they know whether or not illegal activity is taking place at the property, but also making sure that, hopefully we can get a positive use out of the property again sooner rather than later. We're not out there to, so-called salt the earth. We want to make sure that it becomes a positive presence in the neighborhood.
Thank you. And how do you work with law enforcement in shutting down drug houses? And what are the roles of law enforcement agencies?
So, the law enforcement, either through detectives in our narcotics units, will conduct investigations to, controlled purchases of narcotics. We'll have patrol officers who are able to testify about, they've responded to assaults, homicides, any sort of offense that has occurred at the property. And, just as our general role as zone attorneys, we'll go to a roll call for, a precinct and talk to the officers and have them kind of tell us about properties that they are frequently making runs to. And that is, also part of the larger point of these cases is we want to address properties that are soaking up a disproportionate amount of police and city resources. So making sure that, law enforcement informs us of these properties and we can then bring those cases. So law enforcement really establishing a lot of the underlying facts that we need in order to file these cases.
Thank you. And in situations where you filed a case in court, do you bring law enforcement to testify to support your case, or all they do is just file a report with the city attorney's office?
No, we need those officers and those detectives. They come in and they have to testify as to, they can testify as to part of their investigation or, reports or runs, things like that, to establish those facts.
How do you balance the right of the property owners with with the community, with the right of the community? How do you balance those two competing rights?
So a big part of our nuisance investigation group in our narcotics unit is informing owners after an investigation, has concluded that they have this nuisance activity taking place. So a letter is sent via certified mail to the owner. They have to sign for it, notifying them, hey, this activity was taking place on this date. You have a responsibility and a legal responsibility to abate the nuisance and prevent the nuisance activity from taking place. So we're not going to act, and we really don't have authority to act unless we can establish that the owner knows or should know that this is taking place. And if they continue to ignore those notices or not take action to stop the illegal activity, that's when we really have to balance it with the interests of the neighborhood and the safety of the residents to say, basically things need to cool down. It's gotten out of control. It's dangerous for the community. And, as the statute says, it's a nuisance in the sense that it's dangerous for those in and around the property. It's dangerous for the division of police. It's dangerous for anybody who even lives at the property is what we're trying to establish there.
Thank you. Any cases, any particular case, or any cases or case stand out to you that you'd like to share with us?
There was one that really was kind of early on in my career. Is I was working with a community group out on the west side in the Hilltop neighborhood, and they actually were going to do a camp out with kids overnight in the neighborhood in kind of a community garden. And across the street was a property that was well known as a location where drugs were sold and being used. And we knew that this was coming up, but we also, reached out to law enforcement to see if they knew about the property. Ended up finding out that federal officials and local law enforcement had a long-standing investigation, and that it was an owner-occupied property. So Obviously, we had established that there was knowledge that the activity was taking place on top of search warrants that had been executed, and various other, really aggravating factors that made it a good candidate for abatement. So we ended up filing the case, and we were granted an order. I went out when the order was executed, and I think we found maybe 20 people inside of this 900 square foot house, and things were really in very, very poor condition. Had a lot of illegal firearms in the property. We had evidence of drug sales, drug use, and we were able to get that order to board up the property. And then that weekend, or a few weekends after that, the kids came out and were able to have a nice camping trip in the community garden across the street, and able to feel, hopefully feel safe while they were doing that. And so that was really seeing, your case in action, to see a positive result come out of it.
You are able to balance the right of the property owner and the safety of the community. Well, that's a good result. And in your line of work, have you ever faced backlash from people or the community in your attempt to shut down the drug house?
I think there's what you're always, I think, as you said earlier, what you're trying to balance is the rights of the property owner. And so whether it's somebody who has a rental property and, they say, hey, I tried, or I wanted to try to address this issue, but I just couldn't. And so you have to be sensitive to, the property rights of the individual. And like you said, balancing that with the community interest. But as I kind of pointed out, we are very much out in the community, listening to residents to understand what they're really dealing with. So we understand it and personally living in the neighborhood, I understand it at a very base level. What it really means to live next to a property that's causing these type of issues. So you hear from residents, and it's a real concern. They say, this is going on at all hours of the night. I don't feel safe in my house. So in terms of the community concerns, that's what you're really balancing, is the urgent fear and concerns of the community versus making sure that you're bringing a strong case and that you are respecting the property rights of the owner. So, things don't always come together in 2 days. Sometimes you're notified by a neighbor, and it's not until 3 or 4 months later, after the investigation concludes, that you're able to actually file your case. Because while, nuisance abatement and closing down the house is one part of law enforcement's role, you also have situations where there's long running investigation involving some higher profile suspects, or something that's long running, and they want to make sure they get certain evidence out of. So nuisance abatement and closing down the house is absolutely one of the options, but also understanding that law enforcement might have, so you say, bigger fish to fry, or larger goals as part of those investigations.
Thank you. There's this apothegm that is called, they say, prevention is better than cure. And in your experience, what is the best way to prevent drug houses from opening in the first place within a community?
What I would kind of point out is, for a lot of folks who own rental properties, and in our parts of the city, in Franklinton and Hilltop, rental properties make up a large proportion of the housing. And just making sure that, sometimes you have folks from out of state or even out of the country who own rental properties who really aren't monitoring the activity taking place at the property. So understanding that by owning and profiting in a neighborhood, you have some responsibility to make sure that, not just that the exterior of your property is maintained, but that, the property itself isn't a nuisance. So things like background checks, but also, talking to the neighbors of your property and understanding, what's really going on here. Because we frequently hear from folks, oh, I didn't know this was happening. But you have a personal responsibility. You own this property, and you theoretically are making a profit off of renting it. So you have a responsibility to the neighborhood.
Thank you. And there are some cases where landlords knowingly rent their properties to, to drug dealers. How do you approach cases like that, knowing that a landlord knowingly rents the properties to drug dealers?
So it's difficult oftentimes to establish that they knowingly, were renting out to a drug dealer because, we can't necessarily get the conversations that happen between them. Now, you can make certain assumptions based on uh, who they're renting to, background checks that they have or have not done. Uh, it's kind of a difference between acting knowingly and acting recklessly about who you're renting to. So we don't necessarily target folks with the idea that they knowingly are renting out, but if a person has had multiple properties that have had drug dealers or drug use or felony offenses of violence, there are times when we have asked to find them in contempt. And actually, recently, and actually, it's a pending matter, but we had one owner who had multiple drug houses. We filed multiple cases. This had been going on for years and years. And eventually, we asked the court to impose large financial sanctions and jail time. And the court ended up sentencing the individual to a jail sentence and, now over hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines that have been assessed.
Hmm. And what happens in a situation where the owner of the property cannot pay those fines?
So there is an option that we have. Obviously, after those fines run, what we'll do is reduce those to a judgment, and the judgment becomes a lien on the property. And then you can use that judgment and that lien for anything from a foreclosure or, more frequently in our circumstance, something called receivership, which is the process whereby the court is appointing an entity to take control of the property and essentially protect the asset, but also enforce the judgment. And so sometimes what'll happen is, more often it's with vacant and abandoned properties where the nuisance hasn't been abated and the house has become abandoned, where we'll ask for the receiver to take the property, fix it up, and then sell it. And ideally, it then becomes a positive, presence in the community.
Thank you. In a situation where you're able to get either a preliminary injunction or permanent injunction on the property, and you also have innocent tenants living in that same property, how do you handle the rights of those tenants? And what are their remedies?
So, like any other defendant, we have to serve them, and they have an opportunity to present a defense that the activity wasn't taking place, or to challenge our case. But we also at times will make sure that we provide resources to the folks who might be being removed from the property. So something that happens actually not all that infrequently is we have innocent tenant who might be in a bad position where the house has been taken over by folks who are selling drugs, and they did not feel safe or strong enough to prevent them from accessing the property and using the property as a drug house. So in a lot of ways, they are actually the victim, also a victim of the activity taking place. And if we identify that that is the real issue there, we can then sometimes work with them to find them alternative housing or temporary alternative housing, and then potentially provide them an opportunity to move back, but in a way that prevents those folks from moving in on them again, taking advantage of them again.
Are there neighborhoods or areas that are prone to drug houses?
So I wouldn't necessarily say areas are prone to drug houses. I will say the two areas that I handle we file the most cases in. So in my 5 years, the bulk of my cases have been filed on properties that are in the Hilltop and Franklinton, and so I've filed on over 60 properties in these neighborhoods as drug houses. But other neighborhoods such as Southside, Linden, uh, Far East, they're not exclusive to any one area, but we certainly see a large share of them on the west side here in Franklinton and the Hilltop.
Thank you. Is there a correlation between drug houses and violence?
Yes, that's what we frequently see, is that drug sales and illegal activity brings in things such as firearms and often leads to violence and retaliation between folks who might be engaged in this type of activity. So it's very rare that we would just see an investigation where there were drug sales, but then upon pulling police reports for that address, we would not see any other sorts of calls for service, such as disturbances, fights, shootings, things like that.
Have you noticed any change, in regards to drug houses because of the legalization of marijuana in some states?
Nothing specifically. So marijuana is not frequently, or if ever, a substance that we are filing nuisance abatement cases on, because again, they have to be felony offenses of violence, so felony narcotics violations. So what we're really talking about are things, and most commonly what we're seeing is fentanyl, methamphetamine, crack cocaine. Those are the big three that we see most frequently and are the subject of the investigations. Heroin as well.
Thank you. And most drug houses happens to be in communities that doesn't have a lot of resources. So is there a way to balance that to ensure that targeting to shut down drug houses doesn't disproportionately affect communities that are already struggling?
So I think really the nuisance abatement is one part of a larger effort that you try to work to improve neighborhoods and help neighbors. We look at a lot of these communities and make sure that they have the resources there for treatment for folks, for job opportunities and things like that. But what our group does and what our real goal is the very acute issue of the drug house and the immediate impact it's having on the community. So understanding that there need to be those resources out there to help folks get out of the struggle with addiction or get out of a violent situation. But what our group really is, and what these nuisance abatement filings represent, is dealing with, like I said, the acute issue of the danger and the real hazard that these properties are creating for the community. Now, with that said, sometimes what will happen is after we conduct the nuisance abatement, or what will happen is we'll bring out a group such as REACT, which is a division or a group within the Columbus Fire Department that goes out and works with folks who might be in the cycle of addiction. And so trying to provide those resources to folks, but also understanding that we're really balancing the interests of the people who are part of that problem with, the innocent neighbors, community members who are dealing with that.
Yeah. And how does COVID-19 pandemic affect your work in trying to abate nuisance in the community?
Well, I think like everyone, COVID put a bit of a pause on things in the legal system and our ability to file cases and conduct investigations. And I think there was some frustration there. But since then, I think we really have bounced back, and we are kind of right back where we were. I believe in 2022, we filed more cases than we had in any year prior to that. We've been increasingly bumping up in terms of those numbers. And what I will say is that, we've taken a look and we've studied the surrounding areas from the year before we file our case to a year and 2 years after we file our case, because ultimately what we're trying to do is make sure that, there is some relief to the community. So the number of calls for service before we file our case and the number of calls for service after we file our case, we want to make sure that we're, improving the situation. And what we found is a year and 2 years after we file our case, the number of calls for service and the number of serious incidents in those areas, not just at that property, drop off significantly.
Thanks. What advice will you have for community members who are concerned about drug houses in their neighborhood?
So, as I said, a lot of these come in through narcotics tip lines, making sure that you are documenting these incidents. So calling 911 for emergencies, but 614-645-4545 for, your normal police need sort of incidents. What's and as you know, as an attorney, documentation is incredibly important. So notifying the city attorney's office, notifying law enforcement when things happen is incredibly important for us to build a case. Because, frequently you'll talk to a neighbor, or I'll talk to a neighbor, and they'll say this house has been a problem for this long, and these are the sort of things that are happening. But when law enforcement goes and starts to run the numbers and look at the incidents at the property, if no one has called in and no one has reported anything, the attorneys don't have much to bring when they want to file that case. So the investigation is really starting from zero, even if an owner or a neighbor has known about the problem for some time.
What lessons have you learned from your work as a city attorney, shutting down drug houses and abating nuisance that will be applicable to your role as a judge?
Well, I think there's just kind of an understanding of people, really. I mean, I think a lot of folks have a certain idea of what it's like living in some of these under-resourced neighborhoods, living in Franklinton, living in the Hilltop. And I think there are some folks who have, a negative connotation with those neighborhoods and some of even the people living in those neighborhoods. But really what you've got is, by and large, by and large, you've got good, hardworking folks who are just trying to live their lives, work their jobs, and spend time with their family. And, understanding that they're dealing and they're struggling with a lot of different issues, whether those be personal to them or in the community surrounding them. So I think it's just understanding that perspective of folks who are more frequently associated with the justice system and who might be living in those under-resourced communities that, they are dealing with a lot, and there are a lot of struggles there.
Yeah, a lot of struggles there. You mentioned earlier that you're running for the municipal court this time around, which is a different court from the one you ran for last year. So why the municipal court?
Well, like I said, municipal court it's really been my home for the past 10 years. It's a place I feel incredibly comfortable. I've handled thousands of cases as an assistant city prosecutor, and then as a defense attorney, and for the past 5 years as a zone attorney in the environmental division. My experience covers both criminal and civil. I really think I bring a balanced perspective, and one that is holistic for municipal court.
Thank you. Do you have a mentor or a judge that you look up to, that you like to mirror your approach as a judge? Someone that you like to, follow whatever they've done in the past.
So, having been an attorney in municipal court for for a decade or more, what you see is that there are so many judges who have very different personalities. So trying to take the best from everyone. One of my first judges that I was assigned to was Judge Bill Pollitt, who's no longer with us, but had a very strong presence, but a very reasonable and understanding type of judge, practicing in front of Ann Taylor shortly after that. Just kind of a great people person, and trying to bring the best of both worlds. But in terms of mentors, Judge Bill Hedrick is an individual who was formerly my boss, was when I was an assistant prosecutor, then helped out on his campaign. And he has very much been a mentor and someone that I would hope to emulate when I'm on the bench.
Thank you. And you want the people of Franklin County to at least have an idea of what kind of judge you're going to be. Do you have any kind of judicial philosophy, or what are those temperaments that you believe that will aid you in becoming a judge, a good judge?
I think being patient and being humble is incredibly important for judges when they take the bench, and the understanding that you might not know everything, and that you have to be willing to really listen to all sides, respect everyone that comes into that courtroom. And I think part of my work within the zone team and within some of our sort of under-resourced neighborhoods is a valuable perspective, is the idea that you don't necessarily know all the struggles that everyone is going through. And those defendants on those criminal cases that are coming before you, you might be seeing them on the worst day of their lives or dealing with one of the worst, events of their lives, whether it's the defendant or the victim. And then understanding that the attorneys who are representing both the city, the state, or the defendant, are really trying their best, and that they are people too, and being understanding of everyone and having empathy. Having empathy as a judge, I think what I've seen is invaluable in terms of having a good temperament and really being a good judge.
Having empathy and having the willingness to listen, because most of the people that will be coming against you are going through the worst time of their life. That's profound. And what would you like the people of Franklin County to know about you? What makes you unique as an individual?
I really think it is my involvement in the community. I have tried to really be a community attorney, not just in my professional life, but also in my personal life. I've served on the board of the Choices Domestic Violence Shelter. When I was an assistant city attorney, we started a fundraiser called Voices for Choices, myself, along with another prosecutor and some criminal defense attorneys. And we would host a yearly event, and still do, to raise money for the Choices Domestic Violence Shelter. I've served as a volunteer at the Gladden Community House, tutoring students, and served as vice chair of the Franklinton Area Commission. So the idea that our judges, our elected officials, everyone need to be present, need to be visible, and need to be involved in their communities. And I think in that respect, it makes me a unique candidate and one who is well suited to what I think people really understand to be the people's court. Franklin County Municipal Court is the busiest municipal courthouse in the entire state of Ohio, sees a large volume of cases, and it is one of the ways in which your most likely way in which you're going to come in contact with the justice system. So someone who really understands the community, but has, the resume and the background of having been a prosecutor, a defense attorney, and a civil litigator on behalf of the city. I think that's important. Those are great qualities to bring to the bench, I would hope.
So you have the experience of having tried civil cases, criminal cases, having practiced at the same court, so you're well versed with how the court runs, and you're also very professionally versatile.
That's what I hope comes across.
Yeah. Yes. And let's assume that someone is the day before the election, you have someone who's undecided, and they're looking at Zach Gwin and some other person. Let's assume that you're able to talk to that person, to give them a pitch. What will you tell them?
I would say, this is a job and a role that I'm incredibly passionate about. My entire career, even before being an attorney, I was a victim witness advocate, all the way to where I am now, having spent more than a decade within the municipal court system. I understand how this court works. I have the perspective and the community perspective that we need, and the type of judges that I think we need in Franklin County Municipal Court. And I respectfully hope that you would offer me and you would grant me your support. And again, my name is Zach Gwin, and this is for Franklin County Municipal Court. And I would be remiss if I didn't add win with Gwin at the end of any pitch.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you today. And I thank you for coming on this show and for educating us about your fight against drug houses. Thank you.
Thank you. Very glad to be here. I really appreciate you inviting me on again.
Well, you're welcome. It's a pleasure to have you. And I hope this is not going to be your last time on this show as well. And for those of you watching us at home or listening to us, in your car, on your phone, on the computer, thank you. We appreciate your time. Until next time, stay blessed. Bye for now.